So for those who are just joining us, welcome. Maybe you can, as people are coming in, maybe you can let us know in the chat where you're joining us from today. And then I'd like to also remind those who've just joined that we are recording this and that it will be available on the SEB Vimeo page a couple of days after the event, so that it can also be disseminated wider. So I think I'm going to start and just introduce the series. And so welcome everybody to what is now the 16th seminar for 2021 in the Society for Conservation Biology's Emerging Issues in Conservation seminar series. In the series, we feature articles selected by the editors that are recently accepted in early online view or recently published in the 3 SEB journals, those of course being Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, and Conservation Science and Practice. So my name is Martin Strauss, and I will be hosting today's seminar. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Environmental Science at the University of South Africa. I'm also an associated editor at Conservation Sciences and Practice, and in that capacity, I've been organizing the 2021 seminar series to date. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce you tonight, well, at least here in South Africa tonight, to Dr. Kirstie Ruppert, who's our speaker for today. So Kirstie is a social scientist in community engagement at San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance. Her work focuses on understanding the human-wildlife relationships and engaging with communities to integrate research findings into conservation planning and management. And with that, Kirstie, I think it is over to you.
All right, thank you. Let's see. I'm going to start my clock so I have to stay on track. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak today, and Society for Conservation Biology for hosting this seminar series. I do really appreciate being a part of SEB. I'm a member of the Social Science Working Group, and I just always learn a great deal from the diverse perspectives, disciplinary and geographic, of all of its members. So today I'll be sharing about our Pan-African assessment of the trade and use of giraffe parts. Let's see, so as with all or most of these seminars, they're based off recent publications in SEB journals. Our study was published in Conservation Science and Practice in March. So here I'd like to acknowledge the full authorship team for this project, and particularly recognize Matilda Dunn, who led this effort. Tilda is currently a PhD student at Imperial College. While working on this project, she was a research associate at Oxford Martin Program on Illegal Wildlife Trade. And Tilda was contracted by the San Diego Zoo and Giraffe Conservation Foundation to do this work, two organizations where the rest of my co-authors were affiliated for this project. In the process of writing a piece for Current Conservation about this project, the editor team suggested that we include a positionality statement, as our author team is comprised really of individuals from the global north, but our focus is on giraffe, which of course are bound to range countries on the African continent. So I'd also like to acknowledge that positionality here. My involvement in this work is privileged by my employment at a US-based NGO, as well as my professional experiences in development, which have been really deeply enhanced by my relationships with and knowledge acquired from colleagues and local communities where I work in Kenya in particular. Let's see. So our group of authors came together for this project as a result of a Giraffe Science Symposium held in May 2018. And this group came together with stakeholders from NGOs, academia, and African governments. And the purpose was really to identify gaps in knowledge and partnerships around giraffe ecology, taxonomy, health, and the human dimensions. And so then from those subgroups, we meant to produce a unifying giraffe conservation management strategy and framework. And so then within the human dimensions theme, one of the most pressing needs identified was a deeper understanding of the extent of legal and illegal giraffe hunting and trade, which then drove this project. So there's a need for concerted efforts for giraffe conservation and management because as a whole, giraffe numbers have really been in a steady decline. So overall, giraffe across their range countries have declined about 30% over the last 30 years. And giraffe, as currently listed on the IUCN Red List, they have a listing of vulnerable. And that's recognizing giraffe as a single species with 9 subspecies. But recent genetic analyses suggest that giraffe comprise 4 distinct species with 5 subspecies. The IUCN Giraffe Onocopy Specialist Group is in the process now of determining how to proceed with a formal assessment of taxonomic status. And the consensus around this is important for multiple reasons, but most notably for implementing conservation management interventions like translocations, as well as developing conservation policies. So for the study I'm presenting today, we used the 4 giraffe species classification for coding and for organizing our findings. The ranges for those 4 species can be seen here. So up in the yellow is the northern giraffe, reticulated giraffe in blue, Maasai giraffe in red, and southern giraffe in green. And as depicted here, giraffe ranges occur across 21 countries on the continent. There are considerable differences in the conservation statuses of giraffe depending on species, geography, and the threats that they face. So northern giraffe populations have been reduced an estimated 80% in the last 30 years. So as a species, they've not been assessed by the IUCN Red List, again, because current IUCN classification is giraffe as 1 species. But given this estimated decline, northern giraffe would likely qualify as critically endangered. The 3 subspecies that comprise northern giraffe each have listings of vulnerable, that's the West African giraffe. And then the other 2 subspecies have current listings of critically endangered. Let's see, over to the blue, in the reticulated giraffe were assessed and listed as endangered in 2018. And this is based off estimated declines of over 50% in the last 30 years. All of these estimations, excuse me, are in the same time frame of the last 3 decades. Similarly to reticulated giraffe, Maasai giraffe are listed also as endangered and also have an estimated decline of about 50% over the same time period. And then southern giraffe populations are mostly stable or increasing and have a listing of least concern. To note here, that status is referring to the assessment for the Angolan giraffe subspecies. The subspecies of South African giraffe does not have a complete assessment yet, but would also likely have a listing of least concern. And this is, I'm saying this because of really this estimated change in population size. The range here between 150 to 300% is based on the 150% change in South African giraffe populations and the reported tripling of population numbers of Angolan giraffe over the last 30 years. So I also mentioned the different regulatory contexts in the 21 current range countries. Of those, 17 prohibited hunting. So 1 in West Africa, 4 Central Africa, and 7 in East Africa, all prohibit hunting. And then, oops, let's see. Sorry, everyone. I seem to have missed the animation, but then in South Africa, there are 4 countries in Southern Africa, excuse me, that have permitted hunting that is legal. It's South Africa, Namibia, Zambia, Zimbabwe. So of the 21 range countries, 17 prohibit hunting, and then 4 countries have legal hunting with a permit. Declining populations are thought to be driven by the combined losses of, combined threats of habitat loss, disease, and climate impacts. And then in addition, the trade of giraffe and their parts has been proposed as also a contributing factor to population declines. But the impact of trade on wild giraffe populations is really complex and just not well understood. Illegal hunting can happen for both subsistence and commercial uses. And just over the last few years, more and more so, there have been pretty intense public discussions about the role of giraffe trade as a contributing factor to declines. But those discussions have been pretty severely limited just by the current state of knowledge on the prevalences and purposes of trade, which is why our team worked to really target this gap with an African-wide assessment for the first time. And so we structured our study around 4 research questions. The first one, from which range states are giraffe parts sourced, both legally and illegally? Where are giraffe parts used or traded, both domestically and internationally? Let's see. What are the key uses of giraffe parts and who are the main users domestically and internationally? And then finally, what are the differential impacts of legal versus illegal giraffe use and trade on wild giraffe populations? So to answer these questions, we adapted methods described in this assessment on lion part trade. Similarly, this group used and collected data through a specialist survey and a literature review. So the next few slides, I'm going to talk through the methods we used as part of our work. So for the survey, we wanted to gather information from specialists on their knowledge, their awareness, and their understanding of the uses and trade of giraffe parts. So we contacted potential respondents through professional groups. So the ones that were contacted were the IUCN Giraffe and Okapi Specialist Group, the IUCN Sustainable Use and Livelihoods Group, the International Institute for Environmental Development, members of Traffic, and then alumni of the Oxford Martin Program on Illegal Wildlife Trade, and then also authors of relevant literature. And so then once participants self-selected in based on their judgment of the state of their knowledge, they were also asked for contact information of any additional specialists. So some respondents were referred to by members of these other groups I mentioned. The overall questionnaire contained 17 structured questions and had options for both closed and open-ended responses. And then for the literature review, sources were gathered through search engines and online databases using these keywords listed here. The searches were done both in English and in French. In addition, the survey respondents were asked to recommend any published literature or gray literature because we really were trying to find everything, whether or not it was in the published peer-reviewed literature. So, responses from the survey were divided by giraffe range and countries of focus. Out of the 127 individuals contacted, 75 individuals responded. So I think the response rate was around 60%. And then 72 respondents completed the entire survey, and that comprised our final sample. Of that group, the majority of respondents were from academia or NGOs. And the majority of respondents had reported to have worked in conservation, giraffe conservation science or conservation for more than 15 years. So this stacked bar graph here is depicting self-rated knowledge by those specialists. So when asked to rate their own knowledge, 97% of respondents rated their own knowledge as high on one or more topics. Though the highest rated levels of knowledge were in conservation management and conservation policy, which are over here on the right-hand side of this stacked bar graph. There was the highest gap in knowledge around traditional uses of giraffe right in the middle. About 40% of respondents worked in East Africa, and then followed by 36% from Southern Africa. So the lit review sample was screened against criteria for inclusion based on whether it focused on giraffe, as well as the inclusion of bushmeat/wild meat, trade, hunting, or consumption. And so 161 documents were collected. The large majority were published after the year 2000, which you can see here on the left. These were from online sources, printed news articles, peer-reviewed literature, blogs, reports, books, and then unpublished theses or dissertations. So those, the documents included in the literature review sample were coded based on species, based on location, and then gleaned for other information, like whether or not the offtake mentioned was legal or illegal, which types of parts were described, whether the locations of markets were specified, as well as sources of products and sinks for products for the trade that was described in those documents. Of the literature review sample, the most frequently cited country was Tanzania, followed by South Africa. And then outside of range countries, the United States was the most cited. It was cited 19 times, I think, as a trade sink. So this is for both legal and illegal trade. So for our first research question about where giraffe parts are sourced, we asked whether the sources came from captive giraffe, illegally hunted, legally hunted, or from natural mortalities. And respondents were asked to indicate whether those giraffe parts were also traded domestically or internationally to try to provide the source and the sink locations. So legal hunting was indicated as the most common source in Southern African countries overall. You can see that toward the bottom. But some respondents from South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe did rank illegal hunting as highest. And then in the literature, the majority of documents cited illegal hunting as a source across West, Central, and East Africa. So about half of the documents referring to Southern Africa were talking about legal hunting. And then the illegal hunting mentioned in about a third of those documents had noted instances of illegal hunting as unlicensed, so illegal hunting in game reserves or protected areas. So I meant to say a note about how this section is structured. I grouped around the 4 research questions. And so I'll try to describe the specialist survey results and the literature results, and then discuss before we get to the conclusion at the end. So discussion based on the first question. Both the survey and the literature sample point that illegal hunting happens across the population ranges for all giraffe species. Illegal hunting was ranked highest as the source of giraffe parts. So that's including tails, skin, bones, and meat in the Central and East African giraffe populations. The illegal hunting in Central, East, and West Africa is of high concern. As I showed on that range map a bit earlier, the most threatened giraffe species occur throughout those regions, Central, East, and West Africa. So the illegal hunting mentioned in this first question does highlight a need. Some of the results also pointed to particular geographic areas in need. So there were multiple citations of illegal hunting in particular national parks. So one example was in the DRC, but that particular national park, there has been some work done there around an assessment that's shown local numbers to have increased from about 35 individuals to about 60 in recent years. So the findings from this study also pointed to particular national parks, not only in DRC, but also there were protected areas mentioned in Ethiopia, Kenya, and Tanzania. The illegal hunting in protected areas in the Southern Africa region was a bit more difficult to delineate because of the greater diversity in regulatory context. So because of the legality, in some areas, the instances of permitted hunting for trophies, as well as permitted hunting for local level consumption, was kind of included in that section. So our next question, posed whether giraffe parts are traded within and across international borders. Similar to the data about sources, there was quite a bit of regional variation. So domestically, at the domestic level, internal organs was listed in all 4 regions. Tails were also noted as domestic trade by the majority of respondents in Central, East, and Southern Africa. Giraffe meat was also cited for sale at that domestic level in these countries. It was Namibia, South Africa, and Zimbabwe in Southern Africa. And then in Central Africa, the DRC cited domestic sale of giraffe meat. And then in East Africa, some sources cited Kenya as with having giraffe meat at the domestic scale. And then similarly in the literature sample, the descriptions of the domestic trade were more prevalent than international trade in Central and East Africa. Overall, there were a few responses that described live giraffe as a source of international trade. So that came up a few times in Central Africa and about, I think it was about 15 or 16 times in Southern Africa. So live giraffe as a source. And then in Southern Africa, the literature contained references that were about half and half between domestic versus international. So all of this to summarize that across Central, East, and West Africa, illegal local scale markets are the primary sinks for giraffe products. And then in contrast, predominantly legal trade of giraffe in Southern Africa occurs both domestically and internationally. This is important to recognize because in the literature sample, there were media sources that asserted giraffe trophies from Southern Africa have negative impacts on wild populations. That impacts question we'll get to in a few more minutes. But I'd like here to say that the association between those two was not necessarily supported when triangulating data from the peer-reviewed literature or from our survey of giraffe specialists. So instead, those two information sources highlighted the regional differences in the trade and offtake of giraffe, and then had few indications of unpermitted international trade from Southern Africa. So for the third question, we wanted to know about the primary uses and users of giraffe parts. So evidence of use for artisanal crafts, meat as food, traditional medicines, and trophies were prevalent to varying degrees relative to country and region, which you can see here with this figure. This is also considering scale, so domestic or international, and legality of uses. Those were also came up to varying degrees in terms of particular products. But the majority of survey responses, so about 3/4 of all survey responses, cited local rural people as the most frequent users of giraffe parts and products. And that came up in every range country except for Niger. And then this group was followed by people in urban centers as the second most frequently cited user group in Central, East, and Southern Africa. To note, international hunters and tourists were listed more so by the respondents in Southern Africa than any other region. This makes sense considering the regulatory context and that map I showed. Bushmeat, as well as giraffe organs, urine, and fat for traditional medicines, those were all cited more frequently at the domestic level than the international level. So again, the products, meat, organs, urine, and fat for traditional medicines were cited more frequently domestically than in reference to international trade. In contrast, bones, tails, and skins were listed at both scales, domestic and international, but for different reasons. So domestically, bones, tails, and skins were cited most for medicine, crafts, as a status symbol was brought up, and also for decorative purposes. And then internationally, bones, tails, and skins were most frequently cited for trophies. Let's see. And I want to note here that these differences are really important to remember as more and more conservation work focuses on behavior change and highlights the importance of understanding different audiences and different motivations. The variation that I just described about different parts used by different groups and at different levels needs to be taken into account for any interventions to be targeted and tailored for a particular context. And so due to this complexity in the uses and the users of giraffe parts, there's really not a one-size-fits-all approach. That conclusion is likely applicable to many conservation situations. But I want to note here that conservation policies and strategies do really need to reflect the conditions specific to an area. So multiple giraffe range countries have developed national giraffe conservation plans, including these two from Tanzania and Kenya. Niger and Uganda are also examples of countries that have these national plans that think through the particular relative threats in those areas. And again, the findings from our Africa-wide assessment highlight the importance of these country-specific policies for planning to be rolled out for each giraffe species. So our last research question asked about differential impacts of legal versus illegal use and trade on wild giraffe populations. So to get at this question, we asked respondents, to what extent does domestic and international trade of giraffe parts and derivatives occur in your country or countries of focus? And then respondents gave categorical answers like not occurring at all, somewhat occurring, all the way up to frequently occurring. Frequently occurring was reported about giraffe meat, but only by 1 out of the 4 respondents from Central Africa and about 20% of respondents from East Africa. Those are places where the giraffe populations are threatened. In Southern Africa, where giraffe are currently stable, about 25% of respondents noted frequently occurring as the extent of giraffe meat. So to summarize here, meat was listed most frequently as having a frequently occurring extent of giraffe parts, but really only by a limited number of specialists. Instead, the I don't know category of this question was selected for about half of all responses. So this really highlights there's still very limited understanding here, even as gauged by the specialists contacted through this assessment. And then we also offered open space for elaboration on any of these responses. So there were 6 total respondents that had written in responses to this question about the extent that domestic or international trade of giraffe parts occur in their country of focus. 5 out of 6 of those respondents had described trade in Southern Africa and described a limited impact. The 6th response was a respondent from Uganda, and that person asserted that international use has contributed to decreases. So that comprised the kind of the open-ended responses to this question. That was in the specialist survey. In the literature, it was also very difficult to tease apart the impacts on wild populations. In the literature, illegal hunting for meat, tails, and skins were mentioned and described to have a negative impact. But those, for the most part in the literature sample, were describing commercial purposes at domestic markets. So again, at that domestic scale. And then of the documents that were describing legal permitted offtake, only about 1/3 of those documents specified any impact at all. And of those documents that did specify impact, for the most part, in the ones that were talking about legal offtake, they stated a positive impact, noting overall population increases of Southern giraffe, which again, I shared when we were looking at that overall range map. So that is to say that there was some description within the literature sample of either domestic sale or permitted permitted offtake. In the documents, there was also description of exports of giraffe. So about 1/3 of the literature sample were describing exports of giraffe to the United States. Most of these documents cited a single report, but the thing is with that report, it was really pretty unclear how many individuals the parts came from. So if you list off skin, bones, meat, tail, organs, you can't extrapolate how many individual giraffe that came from. So it was unclear the number of individuals. It was unclear whether there was a presence of permits for those parts imported to the US. And it was also unclear what the origins of those parts were. So that was the data for our 4th question from the specialist survey, as well as the literature sample. And so all of that is to say that from both these data sources, it is still very difficult to determine impacts on wild populations with this data. And that's really due to the multiple sources, the scales, and then those diverse uses of giraffe parts and regulations across range countries. I want to circle back to the point that I was making about the importance of understanding motivations of user groups and understanding the different types of uses. This section really also points to the need for management on a country or a regional basis. There are diverse land management mechanisms in these range countries. And then there are also different conservation statuses for the giraffe in each of these places. And so focusing on the different species could really be addressed more accurately based on presenting conditions when done at the appropriate scale. So a few conclusions from this assessment. The study comprised the first ever assessment of trade and use of giraffe across Africa. And really as a first, it's meant to be an initial baseline that then directs further studies. Because of the regional variation and the differences in uses and user groups, our group is recommending assessments specific to particular geographies, as well as assessments for differentiated species. And this is so that findings and recommendations could be interpreted and placed in relation to those different conservation statuses. And then that could even be regions within countries. So there are a few examples of assessments of particular national parks or local giraffe populations that have been directed by those national giraffe management plans and strategies of the example countries I listed a few minutes ago. And all of those more tailored specific assessments can inform interventions that are tailored to those specific contexts. The importance of context is something that I think every social scientist will harp on. So I'm just adding a token of that here. And then importantly, because existing information is limited, increased monitoring and identification of trade routes would really help. So in August of 2019, giraffe were placed on Appendix 2 at the 18th CITES Conference of Parties. So this listing included giraffe as a single species. So considering that current IUCN listing of giraffe as one species with 9 subspecies, all giraffe across the continent. With this designation, international trade is not banned, but instead proposes increased monitoring. And in light of our findings and this assessment, so much of the findings kind of pointed toward the trade and use of parts within national borders. That may or may not be part of any monitoring efforts as tied to this CITES listing. So really the science and targeted management at local levels needs to be directed by the evidence and actors within that system. That is likely to garner positive outcomes for giraffe. And then finally, I want to note that because unintended consequences and the role of misinformation can really be an issue and a barrier to effective policy and management, robust assessments really do need to, as best as possible, tease apart and specify trade as legal versus illegal and at domestic versus international scales. So before moving to questions, I wanted to throw a quick plug. This week's seminar is timely as it's leading up to World Giraffe Day this coming Monday, June 21st. It's the longest day or night of the year, depending on where you are. And it's a great time to share what you learned today or anything else you know about giraffe, as well as the need for giraffe conservation with all of your people. So different zoos and conservation organizations hold events and will be sharing communications. But Giraffe Conservation Foundation's website just really has an incredible number of resources, including comprehensive library, posters, booklets, etc. So you can join me and others in celebrating World Giraffe Day this coming Monday. With that, I want to thank you all so much for coming and listening. For questions about my talk today, or if you want to discuss social science for giraffe conservation, I can be reached here. Or you could just check out the paper in Conservation Science and Practice. I know that in this format, sometimes it's hard to communicate all the differences between the different regions and the many users and uses in user groups. All of our information and data from both the literature sample and the specialist survey can be found either within the article or in supplementary materials. So if you want specifics on the ins and outs of any of those questions, oftentimes I'm going to refer you to those sources as well. So with that, I think we have a bit of time for questions and discussion here.
Thank you, Kirstie, for an interesting presentation. I see there are a couple of questions in the chat already, and a hand has just popped up. So I think we're going to go straight to Janetta Cillier from Pretoria. Janetta.
Thanks, Martin. And Kirstie, thank you very much for a very informative presentation and an excellent paper. So I think one of the challenges, and for my sins, I was actually involved as part of the South African delegation at the CITES convention with the listing of giraffe. And of course, South Africa was, like most Southern African countries, very opposed to the listing for a number of the reasons you listed, in your paper, well, it came out in your paper. I think one of the challenges is that giraffe is one of those species in Southern Africa that actually gets used. Every part of it gets used, but not every part gets used for the same market. So trophies is the main use. A hunter comes out, hunts giraffe, but he doesn't want to take the meat, and it often is illegal to take the meat to his home country. The meat then gets sold locally. The bones goes to a taxidermy, and that then gets sold internationally, but for a different purpose. So ultimately you have a multitude of derivatives derived from the same hunt that goes to different markets at different time frames, which makes analyzing this whole, the whole thing quite difficult. And what is the main use? Where does it come from? And the overall purpose. But I think from a Southern African perspective, the majority of use, or the biggest offtake, is trophy hunting, and everything else is a byproduct from your trophy hunting industry, which across Southern Africa is a permitted activity. But thank you very much. And then I'm just curious, I see you use some of the CITES documentation. Did you use all the documentation submitted to CITES, including, for example, the information documents that were submitted by countries and NGOs, the works, or did you only use the main proposal submitted?
Good question. So I do think that some of the documents that were supporting literature for those proposals were included in the final literature sample. One that comes to mind that I know came up in the literature sample was, I think it was a 2018 report from Humane Society International. That was one of the documents that was cited, not only in some proposals, but in some of the media sources. But I'll have to, I can email you, or you can check the full literature sample in the supplementary materials. But you're right, I think that a really difficult challenge moving forward is teasing apart the many derivatives, because they come from a certain number of individuals, but so many different parts are used. There are parallels to other conservation issues and challenges. I have a colleague that works on illegal wildlife trade based in Southeast Asia, particularly around bears. Similarly, multiple parts are used, and they also consistently think through how to link some of those, some of that monitoring to offtake from wild populations. But what I think is important to note, and I had mentioned that kind of in the section where I was talking about differences between users and user groups, is that those recommendations around demand reduction and behavior change means really understanding each use or motivations, and there's not going to be something blanket. So, understanding the reasons for wanting tails, that's going to need a different probably intervention than some of these other parts. Some of the examples that you mentioned, though, of say meat consumed at local levels from trophies that are legally hunted, I wouldn't even consider that as part of a question of illegally hunted giraffe at international levels, because again, that would be classified as a source of a permitted legal offtake. So you're right, it is really pretty complex, but I think your description was helpful for me, so thank you.
Janetta, you happy?
Yes, thanks, Martin.
Okay. Then there's a couple of comments and questions from Claudia Schuner in Germany. Claudia, I don't know if you want to kind of pick one of those and ask.
Yeah, I have to read them again. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, so I was wondering how in this context your definition of illegal trade would be, because I mean, if people would sort of be poaching for local use, I personally wouldn't consider that being illegal. I just want to get some protein. But I wonder what kind of definition you applied in your paper.
Yeah, that's a good question too. That the case that you just shared would be classified as illegal because it is not permitted in that case. And so, but I do think that this is related to this bigger conversation within the conservation field, that poaching is not one big thing. There are so many different reasons, but you know, the area of focus for that I'm a part of primarily is in northern Kenya, where any and all killing of wildlife is illegal. So we would consider, you know, giraffe meat consumption as illegal, even if it's consumed at that local level. I think the definitions used, we prompted the specialist in the specialist survey in the the description, what denotes legal versus illegal. I just pulled it up. We said legal hunting refers to types of wildlife hunting that are not punishable by under law and regulations, such as trophy hunting, communal own use, and culling. So, and then we said illegal hunting refers to wildlife hunting that is punishable by law and regulations, sometimes also referred to as poaching. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And just wondering if I'm allowed to ask another question.
We have time.
The European Union just sort of passed a law, obviously trying, or the Green Party is very keen on trying to, I'm losing my English, trying to forbid trophy hunting. And you were sort of indicating that the experts were answering in the respect that trophy hunting actually helps to sustain vibrant populations. So this would then actually be quite critical for the survival of the species in the long run. And do you see that the same, or do you think it's a good move trying to forbid all kind of trophy hunting?
That is a big question. So I'm going to, my response right now is going to be based on my personal standpoint. So I don't want to presume to speak for any of my co-authors and, you know, not representing any group that I'm formally a part of, but kind of where I stand is that the authority to determine use of wildlife, I believe that, you know, it's important to recognize the authority of African governments and communities living with giraffe, and also to take into account the diversity that I mentioned. Like every single area of our study kind of focused on the variation of use and rights. I'm also kind of considering this from the perspective of governing commons. So pulling from so much of the work from Eleanor Ostrom and thinking about socioecological systems and community-based conservation, which ultimately presents that groups will and can sustainably manage a natural resource or a common pool resource when the authority to do so is there and the incentive to do so is there. And so this is a really, really big and current discussion. Some groups that I look to try to stay kind of abreast of updates are some of the work put out by, say, Amy Dickman on trophy hunting, and you know, a perspective piece that Amy put out with a group of co-authors and a number of signatories last year set off a pretty you know, fierce discussion about trophy hunting as it relates to conservation. And really the thesis of that perspective piece from Amy and others in science was that without viable alternatives and without overlooking the strong relative threats of some of these other aspects like habitat loss, you know, we really do need to question the relative influence of some countries like the United States like the UK,
Right.
what
Yeah.
you just mentioned, Germany. So that
Yeah.
was around about like all my thoughts on the topic, but thank you for bringing it up.
Thanks. Thank you. Very, very good talk. Very interesting work, actually. It shows you how much baseline data we still need to actually be able to make any kind of decisions.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks, Kirstie. And then there's a question from Mike Peel in South Africa. And it's a pity that Julian and Steph Fennessy from GCF is not here. But Mike says, thank you for a most enlightening talk. It was great. A concern is that there does not seem to be an ongoing research effort around giraffe, particularly as the northern reticulated and Maasai giraffe seem to be in real trouble. Can you comment on that, please?
Yeah, it is a shame. So Julian and Stephanie Fennessy are co-directors of Giraffe Conservation Foundation and co-authors on this work. They are involved in a number of research efforts with collaborators focused on these three species, so northern reticulated and Maasai. I'd say that in recent years, there has been a more concerted effort to bring groups together and focus on these species because of those concerning population declines that you mentioned. So those national conservation management plans and strategies, you notice the examples I shared are from countries where these three giraffe species exist. So Niger has one. The populations have increased in recent years. Uganda has one, Tanzania, and Kenya. More specifically in Kenya, Kenya has 3 of 4 giraffe species. There's work focused on particular giraffe species. So the Reticulated Giraffe Action Plan, for instance, is led by Kenya Wildlife Service and one of GCF's, their East African Conservation Coordinator. So I would say, Mike, I guess that my comment is that more and more work is directed toward those species because of the recognition of the declines and the recognition that, working together, we can intervene on their behalf. I don't know if anyone else on this call wants to jump in on that aspect as well, but thank you for bringing it up, Mike. I agree.
If anybody does want to jump in on that, you're welcome to go. Okay, it doesn't look like that. Kirstie, I had a question. When doing this kind of study, are all literature sources weighted equally? You've got the peer reviewed work where there's an attempt to quality control, and then you've got media reports and you've got unpublished reports and things. Are all sources treated equally?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in our case, they were from the aspect of describing prevalence. So for instance, like when I described in the literature sample, the number of times that say meat was brought up. But within our, because there's some variability in terms of quality or the amount of the level of review, it needs to be interpreted kind of with that in mind. And that's also the strength of having corroborating data from other sources like the specialist survey. So 2 examples come to mind. One is that there were a number of the popular press sources in the literature sample that had mentioned the negative impacts of international trade. I think meat was the product that was specified. That was not verified by the peer-reviewed literature or the specialist survey. And so in that way, that's why, you would work to triangulate to try to, if you can eliminate those biases or limitations, recognize them and try to mitigate them. The other thing that we did need to interpret and consider with the entire set of data were instances of misinformation. So one example that comes to mind is like legal offtake of giraffe was listed in Kenya a few times where there's a national policy there that any take of giraffe is legal, or excuse me, is illegal. So there's an issue there, right? So I would say that yes, if spelled out in the protocols, but interpreted with caution and looking for a triangulation with other data sources.
Thank you. I see there's a comment from Lance Cruz about CITES and what they've done over the last couple of days. Lance, I don't know if you want to unmute and...
Just so you can see me.
Hi, Lance.
Hello. Yeah, well, thank you for letting me join you today. Just a bit of context. I've been policing CITES at Felixstowe Container Port for the last 20 years. Obviously dealing with all sorts of things, but obviously we have seen some hunting trophies. And my interest was piqued when I saw your article, because I think it was probably about 6 years ago, before giraffe were put on CITES, all of a sudden at Felixstowe we were seeing lots of giraffes as hunting trophies. Now, obviously, they were legal at the time, and at the moment we don't see much, but what we have seen is still legal, which tends to back up what you've said earlier. So the last couple of days I got invited to join lots of people from around the world, CITES parties, NGOs, etc., looking at a draft guide that will be issued out to different countries, whoever wants to use it, to help them focus. It's a 5-step process for looking at reducing demand in whatever they deem is a priority at the time. So obviously South Africa will see their priorities as one thing, and whereas internationally around them they might see it as something else. But this guide is for each country or region, because there was a mention with some of the African people doing things from a regional point of view. So that will take a bit of time, because I think it has to be agreed once it's published as a non-draft, has to be agreed at the Conference of the Parties, whenever that, whether it be 2022, hopefully. Yeah, so I just thought I'd let you know that was going on, yesterday.
Thanks for sharing. That's fantastic. I think that's incredibly encouraging. But an area of interest for me is demand reduction, mostly because the recognition that enforcement alone isn't going to, I think, be enough. There's really going to need a combination at multiple scales and angles. So there's this role of enforcement, but also, community-based interventions like demand reduction campaigns. And so I'll be eager to look through those guidelines. Thank you so much, not only for coming, but for sharing them.
Well, the other thing is one thing I did do was share the same document which you showed us earlier, this one about how to understand the demands, how people use different derivatives, whatever. And I follow Mrs. Diogo on Twitter quite regularly. But what I've done as a law enforcement officer is, over 20 years, because it's literally only me as the main guy, is on the one hand work with different stakeholders and other frontline departments, particularly like Port Health, trading standards, to get the job done. But the other thing is to use what is in that document to actually analyse traffic and target, be more focused. For instance, the agar wood is used as an incense from the Middle East. So you can sort of, you're gradually honing things down so that I don't waste my time.
Yeah.
So being a non-academic, it's actually been quite useful to follow academics on Twitter and find these different articles and make use of them. So, thanks for all your hard work.
Oh, wow, thank you.
The other friends, sort of thing. So.
I can see why Diogo is keen on your work too, because of his involvement in work that emphasizes impact evaluation and the need for enforcement records to verify and measure impacts of different interventions, so that we can continually learn about what's working and what's not.
Well, I think that will be one of we're actually being assessed by the UN as a country in dealing with illegal wildlife trade at the moment, and one of the things that will be highlighted will be the lack of access to data, and it's always been an ongoing thing.
Oh.
Thanks, Lance. Kirstie, I had another question about triangulation. You made the point in the paper of having the specialists and the literature and triangulating those two. I was wondering when I read that, do you have any handle offhand of how many of those papers were actually written by your specialists?
I don't have that off the top of my head, but honestly, I would say not a ton, just because what we've also kind of known in the giraffe conservation science community is that, you know, there's just been relatively less attention focused on giraffes. So I think, you know, quite a bit of, let's see, less than half of the literature sample was from the peer-reviewed literature. And I'd also have to take a look and see, you know, so much of the peer-reviewed literature on giraffe conservation science covers aspects of giraffe ecology and health. So not necessarily focused on these human dimensions, which really drove this project. But that is a good point, you know, when it's not like it's not like we're saying and treating them as independent samples, but I see what you mean about the triangulation piece.
Cool, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. We are just a couple of minutes short of our time, but if anybody does have a question, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask Kirstie, perhaps as a last question. Okay, I don't see much coming through. Kirstie, with that, I would then like to thank you for your willingness to participate and to come and present. I appreciate the time that you put in preparing for this and the time that you spent here with us in sharing the research findings. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then lastly, I would just like to remind everyone that we have 2 more of these seminars lined up for June, next 2 Wednesdays. And next week we have Kyle Horton from Colorado State University. And Kyle will be talking to us about near-term ecological forecasting for dynamic aeroconservation of migratory birds. And that was recently published in Conservation Biology. So if you can, please join us next week, register, and hope to see you in next week's seminar. And with that, thank you very much, Kirstie. Thanks everyone for joining. Bernard, thanks for standing by.